Alright guys, Diablo 4 is making some big changes with a brand new patch from the beta feedback. We're getting a drastic update to dungeon gameplay, mechanics, class balance, and a lot more. So let's get started. Diablo 4 open beta retrospective, transforming feedback into change. Of course, one of the most common pieces of feedback from the open beta was that players felt there was a lot of backtracking within certain dungeons, like for example having to retreat to the same path, retrieving carryable objects, and so on. So Blizzard came in and optimized multiple of these across all zones to minimize that as much as possible. You can of course see a list of some of the affected dungeons, but there are a lot more improvements to these gameplay mechanics coming too. One of them, and the biggest here, is to structure objectives, which now have been repositioned to appear more along the main dungeon pathways, making them easier to reach and allowing players to readily explore the dungeon after defeating the structure. Another way they made that a lot easier is to also make doors generate a minimap ping when they are opened. Even more so when carrying stuff like ancient statues, bloodstones, mechanical boxes, or stone carvings. Now you'll receive a momentum buff, granting a 25% movement speed increase to you and your nearby allies. I'm glad they actually did it this way, and it's literally fixing all the issues exactly how the community wanted since day one. This was actually one of the most suggested ways to fix some of the backtracking, especially when carrying back the objects. But Blizzard actually thought this through all the way and made a few more adjustments on top. This includes, of course, channel time for pedestals being reduced from 2 seconds all the way to 0, and returning a portable object to its pedestal now also fully restores health, resources, potions, and fully resets cooldowns for all players. But there's more. They actually added a small number of straggling monsters that will seek out players to help them complete, especially the kill all monsters objectives. Again, this was also suggested by the community, so Blizzard doing a great job at listening. Believe it or not, another one is to the animus resource dropping from enemies in certain dungeons that you would have to then deposit inside of a cauldron to open the dungeon areas ahead. This one now provides the following benefits upon picking up these animus orbs, including one giving you back 10 resources and others reducing all active cooldowns by 1 second, so pretty nice, giving it some additional gameplay functions. They even reduced the dreadfully long 3-second deposit channel time all the way to 0, making them a pretty much instant cast. Now for the rescue minigame, as I'm sure you found these quite common in some of the ice-themed dungeons, all rescues now also drop health potions upon completion to maybe help you a bit with surviving, especially since they also spawn enemies. Plus the time to rescue has been reduced from 3 seconds all the way to 1.5. Moving on though, probably one of the most exciting changes is to the cellars as well as dungeon events, which are now getting a few cool buffs to make them a lot more common. So the chance for an event to spawn inside of a dungeon has increased from 10% to 60%, which is rather drastic. And similarly, cellars also got an increased chance for an event to occur inside of them. They will even consistently reward a chest upon completion, and they also fixed the bug where the guaranteed elite enemy would be absent from inside of them. The main reason you would jump into cellars especially was for the chance, albeit small, to spawn multiple loot goblins inside of them, and when that happened, you'd basically get a massive loot shower. I imagine that between the increased spawn rate of events and the now guaranteed spawn rate of elites, as well as reward chests, you get even more incentives to complete these, plus the fact that they also count to the open world like challenge tracks and so on. But encounters like the Butcher and other bosses are getting some buffs as well as fixes. So this issue that allowed the Butcher, for example, to become unresponsive has already been addressed. This was especially noticeable when playing with classes that had minions, so it would cause the boss to basically just remain still and not do anything. So yeah, do say goodbye to that. Also, the Butcher difficulty gets increased massively to present an even greater challenge, especially in World Tier 3 and World Tier 4. Furthermore, various bosses were re-evaluated for melee character difficulty, resulting in changes to attacks and fight mechanics. Certain bosses punished melee builds a lot more than, for example, ranged ones, and here's hoping that these will also include some of the annoying spider bosses that we kept, like seeing throwing us back in one of the early zone dungeons, but there were plenty more examples like these. Finally, the vampire brutes using the shadow enchant were fixed to no longer chain cast Impale. If you got like in a situation such as in one of the strongholds where it would spawn 2 or more of these enemies, you could literally get impaled back to back and stunned for a very long time, plus a massive life drain if you did not pay attention to their charge up attacks. So yeah, this has been addressed too. But the new update is massive and a lot of balance changes are on the list too, starting with barbarian buffs. We get a flat 10% passive damage reduction, but at the cost of some skill tree passives to have their damage reduction effects reduced to compensate for that. No word on which ones they are, but it's likely going to be a more blanket change affecting multiple perks like the Combat Flay or Martial Vigor, maybe even some of the Shout passive upgrades later on. They also made Whirlwind skills now deal more damage, but also at the cost of consuming more Fury. This is likely going to make Fury generation a bit more annoying early on with this setup, but I assume that once we get some of the shouts in, like Rallying Cry, and other ways to generate more Fury, it should all even out. Finally, the double swing skill enhancement refunds its full Fury cost when used on stunned or knocked down enemies, which is a pretty drastic buff from the 15 Fury that it provided before. Moving on to another disadvantaged class, we have the Druids, which get a pretty interesting buff, so their companions now deal heavily increased damage. The Wolves especially seem to benefit the most out of these, especially if you combine them with some of the other legendary aspects. There were ones that would provide like additional wolves, some that would transform your wolves into werewolves, which are a lot more stronger. Also ones that would increase companion damage as a whole, so this would likely be one of the go-to builds for melee damage early on, and the companions were already super strong in the open beta as it was, even one-shotting certain bosses with a full-on legendary setup like that. But Druids also see their ultimate skills have their cooldowns reduced, a change that should benefit builds that ran with the Cataclysm or the Petrify skills a lot, and this should help a ton with nuking down enemies and bosses. The patch notes also list usability improvements to maul and pulverize, but using a non-shape-shifting skill will also transform the Druid now back into the human form. This last change right here could be a pretty significant nerf, especially to the more hybrid kind of builds that would both utilize, for example, elemental attacks as well as the shape-shifting attacks. So in this situation, you would lose some of the very potent buffs that you would get as a bear or a wolf form, like Mending, which would give you some nice healing from all sources. But there's plenty other like similar mechanics in there that you will no longer benefit since you immediately turn back to human. It's nice, however, to see that the Rogue Subterfuge skills get some love with an increase to the bonuses they provide. However, besides Dark Shroud in this category, I've literally never used any of the other Subterfuge skills, but maybe this will make Poison Traps or skills like the Vanish a bit more appealing in the mid to late game. Finally, I'm now convinced that Sorcerer is Blizzard's favorite class because it literally got even more buff despite already being the top strongest class in Diablo 4 open beta. So Charged Bolt damage was increased and its mana cost has been decreased. This was a change that they talked about previously, where they wanted some of the other early skills to also be useful. In this case, I'm still probably not going to change from the Chain Lightning or the Frozen Orb since they are a lot more useful. Decrease the cooldown for the Incinerate skill enchantment bonus, which was previously just 20 seconds. So yeah, now it's going to be lower than that. Meanwhile, Firewall will now spawn underneath enemies more frequently when used in the enchantment slot. And finally, they increase the lucky hit chance for the Meteor skills enchantment bonus too. The Meteor change in this case sounds the most appealing to me just because it sounds like a really cool setup that you can create. So the chance for that to happen was 3% previously, now it should be like bigger, I guess. So it's probably going to be more worth it to go with a damage over time fire build that has a chance to spawn a lot of meteors on enemies' heads. I think that would be a sight to behold. Anyway, on a final note, some big UI changes are coming too, including ways to remap the move, interact, and primary attack input to different buttons. But probably the most significant is the font used in-game to now be replaced with a different new one. There have been quite a few controversies surrounding the font and the UI that Blizzard chose to use in Diablo 4, some even saying that it looked a bit too like mobile game-ish. Personally, I found it to look fine, but it's nice to see that Blizzard admits that there's room for improvements and are actively improving upon it. That's pretty much it with the changes. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.